welcome to the second of these reading group sessions, reading through Tracks and Traces by Paul Fiddes. It's great to welcome you into the conversation again. And it's my delight to have Mark Ord, who's doing a PhD through Queen's Birmingham and Amsterdam, VU Amsterdam. And he's published articles in the Journal of Baptist Theology and Context, but also the Journal of European Baptist Studies. He's interested in practices, I think, but he's got the most meatiest chapter perhaps in the whole book, although that may be up to grabs. So, and he's going to introduce and discuss this big idea of Paul's, although he wants to say it's the big Baptist idea of covenant. So Mark, if you haven't been part of this, Mark's going to introduce just for about 10 or so minutes, and then we're going to open up for some conversation. Mark might have some questions for us to help us in our conversation, but I'm sure we'll have questions ourselves. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you. I should say the original email I got said 15 minutes, so I may stray over slightly. But yeah, it's a dense chapter, so we'll kick off quite quickly. But the place of covenant theology in Baptist life yesterday and today. So Paul Fiddes picks out this covenant making, the practice of covenant making as a track rather than a trace, something we can go back to. Perhaps the track for Baptist identity and ecclesiology. He starts off with reference to Gainsborough, 1606, 1607, English separatists who committed to join themselves by a covenant of the Lord to walk together in all God's ways, made known or to be made known. And he said that this unites Amsterdam, America, and London, these key sites in the Baptist imaginary. Looking back, he notes that covenant establishes a continuity with separatism, the likes of Robert Brown, who already had in his theology this vertical and horizontal aspects of the covenant. Vertical with God, horizontal with members joining themselves together within the congregation, and also joining themselves to the church universal through the ages. Looking forward, Paul says that there's an openness in covenant theology and practice, an openness to the future, with an understanding of faith as pilgrimage and process. Walking together in trust, he says, is an alternative basis for association compared to the closeness of confessions of faith, something we'll come back to. So his first section is on the meaning of covenant, and he notes that there's a theology of covenant that turned at the beginning of the 1600s on a tension between the conditional and the unconditional within the covenant in scriptures, and this at a time when there was a budding sense of the freedom of the individual. So the conditional aspect was being picked up on, and he notes 4 threads of covenant thinking and practice within the cloth of English Puritan and separatist theology, which he states are woven together in a harmonious pattern. The 4 are: the first is the eternal covenant of grace which God has established with humanity, or at least with the elect, for salvation in Christ, and this eternal covenant is the basis of all covenantal talk in scripture. The second is an understanding of covenant as a transaction between the Son and the Father to bring about the salvation of the elect. He says that covenant was implicit in Calvin, but was developed by Calvinist theologians in the 17th century. There are references to it in the London Confession, 1677, and a fantastic phrase from Benjamin Keach he uses to quote some way. He pictures Jesus Christ as striking hands with God the Father in behalf of God's elect. So covenant is primarily seen there as between the Father and the Son, and the church and believers get in on it through confession of faith. The third strand of covenantal theology is the conviction that God has established a covenant with the church as the means for dispensing salvation. It picks up on the debate at the time as to whether or not this was an unconditional or conditional covenant. So separatists obviously saw this as a conditional covenant with obligations and duties accruing to the church, and therefore had been voided in the context of the Church of England. He notes here as well a relationship between the first strand and the third. There's this unconditional election of the invisible church, that aspect of covenant, and then there's the conditional covenant with particular congregations or national churches. Then comes the fourth strand, and that's the covenant that members establish amongst themselves and with God on forming or joining local congregations. Two parts to this, between God and the faithful, and between the faithful mutually, what he refers to often as the vertical and the horizontal together. This has got language of giving themselves to God and to each other, of walking together in light given and in light yet to dawn, and also a commitment to watch over one another. Practice of covenanting included, he notes, signing the covenant, and he quotes Nuttall in a lovely phrase that says this satisfied their sense of being individuals. In that context, that was important. This became, he notes, a standard way of forming and entering churches, and he charts the way that this fell out of favour when the practice of believers' baptism came in, but still sort of reasserted itself, persisted until the 18th century. So this period of signing covenants and covenantal language remained important for Baptists. He goes on to talk then about the relationship between the eternal and the local covenant. Point out, as I've already noticed, that separatists like Brown had already weaved together strands 3 and 4, seeing that the local church had entered into this covenant that God opened or upheld with the church in general, such a way that local churches could live under the rule of Christ, be given the seals of the covenant, and have legitimate ministry. Baptism, the Eucharist, the communion, and the ministry of local churches were legitimate and part of the church universal, as they lived within that probably conditional covenant. But Fiddes notes with B.R. White a stroke of originality, which in another chapter he calls a creative theological step from Smith, in linking the horizontal and vertical, seeing the eternal covenant of grace. Seeing the eternal covenant of grace made contemporary in the particularity of a local congregation's covenantal practice. So that uniting the first strand, the covenant of grace, with the fourth strand, the local congregation. And he says that Smith weaves this first and fourth strand together within the local covenant because God gives Christ when the local church covenants. God gives Christ and all else with him. The eternal covenant becomes actualized in the particularity of a local congregation. And he acknowledges that this is not systematically worked out through Baptist theology of covenant, but remains tantalizing, he says, in Smith and others. Again, he quotes Keach, who sees the covenant of the local church as an accomplishment of the promise, which adds nothing to the grand covenant, but instead church covenants are occasions for believers who personally enter into covenant to lay hold of that eternal covenant. Local church covenants are therefore lined up with the covenants made to Moses and Abraham. They're instances of the eternal covenant of grace. Fiddes wants to go further and see strand 4 and 2 interweaved. 2 is that relationship with that covenant between the Father and the Son. Fiddes wants to move this away from the federal transactional view of covenant in what he terms a legal bargain about atonement. And to do this, he refers to Barth, and particularly 2 resources from Barth, 2 moves that Barth makes. The first being seeing God's covenant decision as identical with God's work in history. Election happens as God's enables a yes to God's prior yes, rather than being an absolute decree back in the sort of mysteries of eternity. The second move is that the covenant of grace is viewed as shaping the relations of love within the Trinity. Barth says this we know because Jesus as a human person is inseparable from the Logos, or the eternal Son. God has elected humanity for fellowship in Christ and elected to be the covenant partner of humanity. These 2 moves, the internal Trinitarian relations as covenantal. He acknowledges that Barth doesn't use the language of covenant for the same reason that Fiddes wants to move away from that transactional notion. Barth didn't like that either, but he cites Bruce McCormack, a Barth scholar, as describing Barth's thinking on Trinitarian ontologies as a covenant ontology. So he says, when we enter into covenant in the church and we enter into a relationship with the vertical aspect of that covenant, we are entering into those relations within the Trinity. So Baptist covenantal practice, he says, is also a participation, not simply in the covenant of grace, but in the internal relations of the triune God. This theologically thick description of covenant, he claims, should resonate with Baptists and help avoid understanding covenant in terms of strategic alliance for the purposes of shared tasks, economies, resources, that kind of thing, which he thinks reduces the notion of covenant to something not theological. He also explores the relationship between covenant and salvation. Here, just one point of interest in it is that he makes the point that the practice of covenant making had theological repercussions. The conditionality of covenant over time modified the prevalent Calvinism of particular Baptists and their notion of irresistible grace. That is to say that right church order and church discipline became over time marks of salvation in an age of anxiety about salvation. Those seeking assurance that they were amongst the elect could have recourse to church discipline, i.e. the quality of their lives, and right church order within the sort of separatist type churches. So conditionality entered into a particular Calvinist theology and modified it. He notes, of course, that conditionality of the covenant was acceptable already to that emerging Arminianism of the General Baptists, with its emphasis on free will and resistible grace. Fiddes believes that the practice of covenanting nudged Baptists to blend Calvinist notions of enabling grace and Arminian stress on freely choosing Christ. Covenant expressed, in this sense, the mystery of divine grace and human freedom and held them together. This, he goes on to claim, reinvigorated mission amongst Baptists, as seen in Fuller's reminted evangelical Calvinism. And perhaps we could just note this, that this may be a good instance when we can see a Baptist operant theology impacting its formal theology, that the practice changed the formal articulations of theology over time, and that's where it can be seen perhaps in Fuller's evangelical Calvinism. Fiddes knows, he goes on to talk about the covenant and voluntary societies, and I think this section is particularly interesting because he knows that there's another way of reading Baptist practice of covenanting, and it's one that evacuates God from the practice of covenanting, turning it into what he calls a dead metaphor, because it simply focuses on the mutual and conditional aspects of covenant to the detriment of the unconditional and the divine, the vertical. This definition of the church as a voluntary society, simply of people deciding to come together, that people enter into freely, was already articulated in John Locke's Letter of Toleration. He quotes this. And he quotes also Brackney noting that Locke, when he came to talk about voluntary societies, had been immersed for several decades in nonconformist ecclesiology. In another text as well, Brackney also cites William Carey as a champion of voluntarism. So we see this sort of solid Baptist input into the forming of notions of voluntarism and the voluntary societies. And we see here the interaction of influence between nonconformism and the evolving sense of modern society and individualism. I'm just going to stick in a quote from Charles Taylor about this, because he refers to this, and I think it sort of sheds some light on it, where he refers to a way of operating of certain Protestant churches at the time in the 1600s, where one was not simply a member in virtue of birth, but where one had to join by answering a personal call. This in turn helped to give force to a conception of society as founded on covenant, and hence as ultimately constituted by the decision of free individuals. So this voluntarist emphasis focusing on free and unencumbered choice, becomes a dominant vein through Baptist thought and practice, not just in our church government, but also in our seeking of converts. Fiddes picks up the secular models of the voluntary society predated the Baptist history by about 100 years. And he alludes to this joining of the practices of early capitalism with Baptist practice of covenanting when he comments on it resonating with Locke's principle of marketplace choice. We could also note here that Willie James Jennings has taught us what to expect from such a merger, that ecclesial practices buckle and the Christian imaginary becomes tainted. There's a pile up in this little section, there's a pile up of testimony of a covenanting practice that muted the divine and elevated the mutual consent of believers. We have Smith, Keach, Gill, Angus, Gilhorn, who I'd never heard of before, all talking about covenant without reference to God. Angus approves Locke's definition of church and the analogy of free trade, and God's covenanting slips from view. Angus says that covenanting becomes a focus on mutual instruction and comfort and the propagation of faith, i.e. mission. Fiddes notes here that we come to a point of pragmatism because churches associate to get things done rather than being drawn together under the rule of Christ. And so he proposes covenant as a richer basis for relationships, even as a way of underpinning national unions beyond the practical concerns for things like mission. A proposal I think that was never really taken up. Lastly, he talks about covenant and confession of faith. Fiddes notes that confessions of faith are seen as the basis of covenantal life historically, along with covenants, that the book of covenant and the confession of faith were kept together. He also poses a question if the covenant of faith would be a worthwhile underpinning of our national. No, sorry, he also explores the question of whether confession of faith is a worthwhile underpinning of our union life at present, something that he knows is being discussed at the time and is not convinced of in the slightest. He notes the differences. Covenant is a participation in God. It is a walking together in trust as part of the journey of salvation, whereas confession is an articulation of what is believed. He talks about the declaration of principle of the British Baptist Union as a form of covenant based in Christ with the nature of baptism mission as our way of walking together, and states, quotes something to declare the document of the Baptist principles back in the day, that the text should always be subordinate to the relationship. He concludes where he started simply by saying that this walking together metaphor in trust rather than in being closed in by a confession of faith chimes with modern aspirations for openness to others and the future. He says more than that, but that's all I can fit in to the time. And should I put some questions in the chat box? I don't know how I did for time on the end, but I think we're there more or less. I've probably come up with a few too many questions, Andy, but I'm putting them in and we can see.
Fantastic. Mark, thank you for that. Whistle stop tour. I'm surprised you even had a moment to breathe.
I didn't know.
But very helpful overview for those of us who needed a reminder or just to draw our attention to some things. Mark, quickly talk us through your questions. And then... Yes,
yeah. So simply first, the first one is that Paul Fiddes talked about the history of covenant, but also referred to a renewal of interest. So that in the 20 years leading up to the publication of this book, further 20 years on, do we think that this claim has stood the test of time? Is there still a renewal of interest, and is it still fruitful, I suppose, for the time in our present time? After the central point of covenanting as participation in God leads Baptists to viewing church members' meetings as a participation in God. Does this seem like good theology, and does experience confirm this argument? Is church discipline a watching over one another, which is the counterpoint to walking together. Is that even a viable option in our individualized and privatized cultural context? And if it isn't, is covenantal practice still possible? The one that really interests me is that Fiddes hoped that a theology of covenant would be fruitful within the context of secularism. We might want to just ask how so, but has this been the case, or can it still be the case, especially as covenant theology and practice is viewed as complicit? Oh, sorry, I've miswritten that. Is in the shift to the secular. And lastly, what is at stake in Fiddes' discussion on the basis of interchurch relations as covenant rather than confession of faith?
Some excellent questions there. So we open it up. You can unmute yourselves. If there's a question that wants to grab you to get us started in our conversation, feel free. So the original essay was written in 1999 for a fresh year for Barry White, obviously then published in Tracts and Traces 2003. 2001, 2002, the Baptist Union. So after he actually written this paper, something called Covenant 21 came out, which the Baptist churches and the Baptist Union were encouraged to have a covenant service at the beginning of the millennium, which we might call the high point of covenant theology, or not maybe. And then just interestingly, for those outside of the UK, or you may not be aware, there was an edition of the Baptist Together magazine, so the magazine of the Baptist Union of Great Britain, back in about 2015, 16, which then was all about covenant again. So it kind of lingers around, but Darrell Jackson, who's on the call, when he did his research, he felt, Darrell, you can speak to this, that covenant really didn't convince everybody here in the UK. And I think it'd be interesting to see whether covenant language resonate at all in the States or in Australia as well as where we think it might be in the UK. So I think that first question might be a good place to start. So I wonder what people think.
I'm looking around at the videos on the thing. I think possibly I may have been the most recently trained person on the call. I'm not sure. I may be doing a service. And Laura, I think, was quite young. It wasn't a conversation we had at all at Spurgeon's between 2012 and 2015. I mean, I think language of covenant came up in discussions of Calvinism.
Sure.
But as a central idea in Baptist ecclesiology, I'm struggling to recall a single lecture or discussion about it, for what that's worth. And I would have thought Spurgeon's was probably the location where, leaving aside Paul's attachment to regents, you might expect more kind of evangelical Calvinistic conversations to happen. So yeah, so and it has. I don't recall it having come up with any minister that I've been in conversation with in the years since leaving Spurgeon's. I'm now doing a PhD at Aberdeen, so I don't come across other Baptist thinkers that often. But yeah, I don't think it's an idea that really has really grasped the ministers that I'm in contact with in the UK. I know in the US, there's the Wesleyan Covenant Association, is a kind of evangelicals reaching for the language of covenant as they've tried to reestablish what it means for them to be Methodists, which I find interesting. So obviously most of them are consciously rejecting even evangelical Calvinism, for what it's worth.
Thank you, Phil.
And Andy, you didn't mention, I'm just having a look, I can't find in my copy of Gathering for Worship when the actual date is, but there's some quite significant patterns that take the covenant idea. So obviously, I think Chris Ellis and Myra Blythe took hold of it, and so there's covenant renewal pattern, there's covenant language in some of the baptismal liturgies. There's covenant patterns in the Lord's Supper. So I think it was grasped by some folks, and I suspect if Baptists have had any encounter with some of the covenant language at the local church level, it might be through the use of things like Gathering for Worship. So. Yeah,
that came out in 2005, but yes, yeah, no, you're right.
Andy, you kind of named me, so let me quickly add my small contribution. I think I tend to agree with Phil's observations. As part of my research that was wrapped up ultimately in my doctoral work, I interviewed not only those people who were part of a local congregation, i.e. as members or as regular attenders, but also interviewed a good number of pastors, partly because I was interested to investigate whether, as Phil observes, whether pastors were using language of covenant. And for me, the standout conversation in all of that, and this is where I think Phil's contribution is interesting as a Spurgeon's graduate, that the one pastor that kind of shocked me a little bit was Simon Jones. Some of you might know Simon Jones was a member of faculty at Spurgeon's and had been pastor for many years of some fairly sizable churches. But Simon's observation was that particular form of understanding local congregation was not part of what he both found convincing as a pastor, but also was not part of the conversation at Spurgeon's at that point, certainly. That chimed with my own observations, actually, that and tracing I was more interested in the kind of, as it were, the track or the trace through the kind of late 19th and then 20th century. I find Paul's language interesting in that when he refers to there are those amongst us who are considering covenant, and then lists a number of the particular projects of the 90s. It's a kind of wonderful and, I guess, classical kind of scholarly move to talk about those amongst us when it was actually Paul in his work with the various committees of the union that he was either chairing or a part of. And I guess I have a degree of empathy with Paul's modus operandi, and as a theologian, convinced, I think, probably at many points of the strength of his intellectual arguments, he tends to leave it there. And it's possible that had he been a more wily political animal, there may well have been ways in which his thinking would have then gone further and wider. But he just felt that the value of his argument was in the intellectual capacity of what he was doing, and that would persuade. But it does seem to me that that the idea really was kind of worth considering in passing. But my chapter does suggest that certainly towards the end of the certainly as we turn the clock over into the early 2000s, the idea was beginning to lose momentum as a thing that galvanized and captured the imagination of the body, the Baptist body collective in the UK, at least. And one little short sentence was a standout for me as I reread this chapter, and I'd not noticed this before. And on page 32, he makes the comment, "Covenant and Catholicity belong together." And I find that fascinating because, of course, a lot of the energy now in this area is focused on the notion of Catholicity, it seems to me. And whether that's a more compelling concept, I'm not sure, but it's interesting. I just found that little phrase as a standout as I reread this last night. I thought, that's interesting. I've not noticed that before. Wonder where that takes us. But those would be my sort of, I think, initial comments.
Thank you, Darren.
Darren, could sorry, Karen, you go. I'll pick up.
No, go ahead.
I just really wanted to ask, what was the kind of ecclesiology that Simon Jones and perhaps I think you said it resonated with you, his response when you said that the covenanting ecclesiology wasn't where what he was seeing and living. What was more compelling to him?
Gosh, I'd have to scratch back around in my notes probably, Mark. But I guess if I can qualify or nuance what I've just said, I think what Simon was really saying was that in his conversations with groups of pastors where they're gathering monthly, in sermons, in their writing, in their church newsletter pieces, he did not see the use of this language. Now, where he positioned himself probably wouldn't be too far from this particular stance, but I think he was reflecting back to me that he didn't come across this language, and it wasn't part of the curriculum at all.
It would seem to me the alternative covenant possibly is a form of voluntarism, and that I think is rife in Baptist life. Karen, you wanted to come in.
I just wanted to say I don't think this is somehow Paul's idea that he somehow picked up, and then he was part of a group in '85 who wrote "Bound to Love: The Covenant Basis of Baptist Life and Mission." Barry White, actually, before that, it is drawing on our history, on Baptist heritage. It's not something that was just sort of plucked out of the air and theologically, oh, this is a good idea. And I can say I taught it in Cardiff for over 30 years, and many of my students did go out and work with their churches to make covenants. I mean, they understood that this was part of our heritage, and actually saw that it's much better to talk about God drawing people together and binding us together, rather than somehow, oh well, we chose to go together. It's like consumer model of church. You can call it voluntarism if you want. I call it consumerism. And I think it is something that is not part of our heritage. And this Paul was trying to draw us back. That's why he called it a track. He was trying to draw us back to what was the original vision. And the idea was, God calls us together and draws us together. I would want to say, biblically and theologically, how else are we in Christ if it isn't that God has called us to be in relationship with God and one another and drawn people together?
Thank you, Karen, for that. Yes, I think you made lots of good points and observations there. Laura or Derek, how does this play in the States?
Yeah, so I put something in the chat if anybody wants to. I don't actually know the particular church that I posted, but I always when I was first introduced to this, I guess in the mid 2000s, I kind of had to walk through because at least in local country, like missionary, your more individual oriented Baptist churches in the States, there's a pre-printed church covenant that they actually pass around and like post on the wall. And so I just put a link to it. You can kind of see it's in that, like, the font is old. I mean, it's like sacralized in the way I honestly, the way it's in the font on the link is the way I always saw it posted. It's like you post it like that and you put it on the wall in that church. And I think that's maybe like the fourth form, but it kind of sits in the middle of that line if I sit and read it very closely with what Paul was talking about in terms of like the grace through Christ and all, like linking it together. So there's like this nascent formal theology, I guess, to use Mark's, I'm not sure which one, Mark, if you want, like, because I liked your formal and operant theology comparison. I'm just like trying to think through what they were doing. So I'm not exactly sure how much covenant shaped most of life, but it seems to have an ecclesial tie in somewhere in some of these churches, even though it may not actually override any of the sort of independent voluntary, like I don't necessarily see these churches as being very interested in larger associations or unions. That's very much a local church covenant kind of idea. So anyway, that's kind of how I personally, as an American from the South, from the country, in terms of my relatives and the most Baptists, had to walk through it. So, but I think when we were talking about it at Duke, it was also very much tied into reviving ideas of what Karen was talking about in terms of like being gathered together instead of individual choice, and then also carried on into discussions of how like scripture was to be read and interpreted together instead of in individual isolation, because that was a big issue in the States at the time, like in 1995 and on. So I think that's kind of where I see this landing. As a missiologist, I think it's this conversation about that Paul seems to want to have about like mission, and did mission drive us into voluntarism, or was that just, or has it always just kind of been a tension? Those are kind of questions that I continue to have, because the roots of mission association, like with Fuller and all of that, were definitely more of like being drawn by God to do such things rather than feeling like free and individual choice. Just, you know, so anyway, but that's a
very quick question with a quick answer, because Derek may want to come in. So when you were at Duke, were you reading Tracts and Traces?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's one of the observations. I don't think at Spurgeon's, and possibly other places, South Wales and possibly regions permitting, people were reading Tracts and Traces. Part of doing this reading group is I don't think Tracts and Traces has been read enough. But anyway, Derek, did you want to jump in?
I'll just add a few things to what Laura said. So when she said it was that covenant is posted on the wall, oftentimes it takes up the entire wall from floor to ceiling. So just imagine that, the size of the wall. Just I've definitely seen versions that are that large. The other thing I would point out, or may observe, is I think in the United States, if in the last 20 years there's been language about covenant, it probably has been held by conservative, largely Reformed groups of Baptists that have kind of taken that language. And I'm not sure that they really are doing the work that Paul is doing with it either, but they mean it as some kind of a binding thing that is a little bit more than just associational life. So there is that. And then the other thing is, I mean, there are American Baptist theologians who are interested in ecumenism, and they find Paul's suggestions about covenant and Catholicity quite useful. And those are the other Americans that are talking about covenant, are people that are interested in interchurch relations, as Mark put it in his questions. And so I think but oftentimes that is emerging from a critical engagement with Paul's work, actually.
And I think the interesting thing, Phil, coming with your observation in a sec, is actually perhaps Paul's covenant work has found more of an audience or a following at that ecumenical level than perhaps at the local church level, which is perhaps interesting and worth a conversation. Phil, did you want to come back in? You said with an observation.
Yeah, I think there are two things that strike me listening to what's being said. One of which is about the location of Paul's writing. I think it was Daryl made a really interesting observation about Paul writing from the academy rather than from the church. And I think that's really helpful in some ways. But in others, I think it highlights or perhaps it's more of an explanatory thing, it's the divergence of some of the way that Paul's writing was moving in the 90s and into the noughties from what was being taught in the theological ministerial training colleges, which are much more emphasized on reversing church decline. So missional church over, I mean, I must have done 6-7 modules on missional church in some form or another, to the point where I thought it was crazy, but that's how it was in the 2010s. And we didn't read Tracts and Traces once, and I wonder whether the lack of the language that Paul uses being embedded in the churches in the UK is partly because of his the location from which he was writing. Now, I may be completely wrong in the context of Wales, but in England, at least in the south of England, that seemed to me to be a factor. The second thing is, I wonder whether or not, actually, despite the fact that Paul's language of covenant isn't widely used in the areas that I move in, the concepts he talks about actually are more prevalent. We certainly have a statement of faith, and I know that Paul regards confessions not as something that's to be necessarily equated with covenant, but when people become members, they agree to submit to the statement of faith, and to do so in partnership with everyone else who's in the church, and to recognize that they're coming together as representatives of the body of Christ, right, in a particular place. Now, we never use the language of covenant because it's not meaningful, I don't think, as a practitioner to use that with people coming from different Christian traditions. But I wonder whether that's replicating some of what Paul is seeing there. and as seeing as virtuous is essentially just describing in other language the normal process of incorporating members into a Baptist church and agreeing to watch over one another in love, to use Wesley's language, to give, to be subject to church discipline and so on, albeit not in the language that he's using, and not with the quasi-Calvinistic framework behind it, theological framework behind it. And I mean, to Karen's point earlier, I wonder whether, certainly for myself, and I wonder whether for others, to the extent that we give any thought to the question about how is it that we are called together as brothers and sisters, certainly I would tend to locate that more in a pneumatological phenomenon of being engrafted into Christ spiritually in baptism than in the act of making the covenant, which I do think tends more towards voluntarism. I wonder whether the move towards voluntarism is just implicit in covenant, in the use of covenant language. It's almost inevitable that that's where it ends up. And then there is some sense in Paul's chapter of him moving, as was helpfully outlined in the beginning, between these different understandings of covenant. That in theory, we might say, well, there's a divine covenant that in some sense commercializes the Trinity, and that we're engrafted into that prior commercial agreement between the Son and the Father, which is quite 17th century language. But in practice, the way this works out is we join the covenant because we agree, we make a contract with one another. And that
it's not a contract. I mean, historically.
Yeah, no,
let me just say, historically, the written covenant simply confirmed something that they recognized had already happened. They had been brought together by God into relationship, and they knew relationship with God and with one another. They were in Christ. They were bound together in the love of God in a way that they had never been before. So the written covenant was simply an expression of something that had already taken place and that they recognized was covenant love.
I mean, I can understand the theory of that. I suppose my reflection, speaking from the location of the church, is in practice, what's happening is that people understand that when they make the promises, something is happening. They're not just recognizing a prior reality that existed without it having happened. The covenant, when it works out in the context of the church, operates more like a marriage, where it actually affects something at the decision of the parties, rather than simply being a recognition of what's happened previously. Now, I'm not saying theologically that's what's going on. What I'm saying is the overwhelming impression is that that's what's going on.
And this is the very thing that Paul is arguing in the book, is that we recognize, and I think I said this at the last meeting, that it is God. We're recognizing something God has done first and foremost. You know, we're not consumers deciding, oh, I like this better or I like this better. I mean, we're recognizing what God has done. God
we also believe as Baptists,
together in covenant.
We are, I mean, this is revealing my quasi-Arminianism, but there is a sense in which the grace which is poured out sovereignly by God is received by the individual in the act of making the covenant. The covenant is effective. It does. I mean, I didn't read Paul as saying that the covenant doesn't actually achieve anything. There is a sense in which the people bind themselves together, recognizing the initiatory grace of God, but they do something by making the covenant. Otherwise, the covenant's not necessary.
No.
So I think the differences between the covenant and the written covenant. But anyway, I'm going to see if James or either of the Tims or Stephen or Ashley or Gareth or Brian, who haven't said anything yet, or any of those who are not visual, want to jump in. Tim, you talked about being at 2 churches recently. Tim Ferguson.
Yeah, I'm today and last week, 2 churches that stood up to read their covenants. One was very old language. I would suggest probably Victorian era language. One was much more modern, based on the prophetic church, the inclusive church, so on and so forth. I think what I find, Phil, what you said earlier on about the fact that Spurgeon's covenant wasn't mentioned, I confess I find that a little bit depressing and quite intriguing, because I think that for people in my generation, I think covenant is assumed, but then I'm a product of Regents when Paul was there. And certainly, I guess, in a lot of the work I'm doing, I have my head buried in the ministerial recognition rules, which in the preface refers to the covenant between ministers. And then a lot of my work is to try to establish a meaningful expression of the covenant relationship between ministers. Is what I'm always trying to encourage. It just makes me wonder whether I'm just speaking into thin air if people actually don't know what covenant is or don't see it as part of their theology. So I've got some questions to ask myself of that. So that's quite fascinating, just how common it is understood. And I'm making a distinction here between ministers and churches, where I think churches, I would agree, I don't think it's really embedded in their life, even if they are standing up once a year and reading out covenant.
So that covenant language in terms of ministers doesn't come in until about 2001, 2002. Stephen, I don't know if you can, so it comes in late. So I think for a whole lot, and I think the problem is where did we talk about covenant in the UK? We talked about it at Baptist Union Council. We were not talking about it in associations. We weren't talking about it in some colleges. We weren't talking about it at the local church. The conversation was being had at Baptist Union Council. And I think that was the problem. It never we attempted it with Covenant 21. And I would presume that actually quite a lot of churches might have done that in 2002. But whether it was an ongoing thing, and I hear Ashley's point about gathering for worship, that it remains there. And again, people may make a nod to that, but and I think this is your point, Karen. I think this is a theological idea, not just something that we do. So it's not just a practice. It's got to join it with a whole theological understanding, and I don't think that's ever grounded itself, at least in most Baptist churches. Brian.
Can I just for a start say hello, Tim Ferguson? It's good to see you.
Hello, Brian. Nice to see you too as well.
Yeah, good. The church in which I'm in membership is Kirby Muxloe Free Church. And we are affiliated to the Baptist Union. I think historically, they affiliated to the Baptist Union because there was a system in place whereby that they could get ministers. But the churches, as someone earlier mentioned, about people coming from different traditions into that church because it is the local church, and there are people from Congregational, then URC, Methodist, and Anglican too. So there's a whole variety of people who certainly don't think or act Baptist, although we are in membership of the Baptist Union, and I think the Constitution requires the church to have an accredited Baptist minister. But at the moment, the church is in flux. We have had a lot of people in those middle years, those active years when they've got young families, who for one reason or another has moved away. And also COVID has made its impact on the church. But at the moment, the congregation as a whole are just sitting there listening to what's served up and finding very, very few ways in which they can engage in what's happening. Now, as a long retired minister and realizing what a pain in the neck old ministers can be in churches, I have felt that I've still got something at least to offer. And this very morning, last week, I said to the minister, could I have 5 minutes? And I had that 5 minutes this morning. He's struggling to encourage the people to see themselves as the body of Christ in the community in which we're settled. That's becoming very difficult at the moment. So in order to try and give him some backing, I looked, obviously having been reading Tracts and Traces, but I also looked at the Declaration of Principle, and I took the first clause. And this morning, I tried to encourage people to think in terms of being gathered together, walking together, and watching over one another, and also that idea of the covenant, but also in addition to emphasize that the privilege that we have of coming together in the church meeting. We have a church meeting next Sunday, and I was trying to give some encouragement for that. But I think that the language, the theological language of covenant and what it means, church discipline and all that, the kind of things that we are discussing, we have to find the language to communicate that to the people in the pews. I did have one or two reactions. One or two people said, can we have a transcript of what you'd written? So I'm hoping that that will encourage people to come to a church meeting and not to be so bothered about whether we tarmac the car park or have a new kitchen. That it will give our poor minister, who I feel is struggling at the moment, some encouragement if people come and begin to ask questions and also express themselves. To go back to something that Karen was saying, which I feel is very much the vogue in terms of Kirby Mutlow Free Church, and I'm sure many others, is that idea almost of consumerism. We take it, if we don't like it, we'll go somewhere else. But I think that it's sometimes a matter, I have to bury a lot of my tastes in music and the way worship is done. And I feel I'm there not to satisfy my tastes, but at least to be a covenanted partner in the body of Christ in that place.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. I'm going to bring in Stephen, then Ashley.
Only three quick comments, really. One is reflecting back what is now a generation, to remember that tracks and traces, and indeed the whole idea of covenant, came to the boil really when there was considerable change and upheaval amongst the Baptist Union in Great Britain, as they were thinking the way forward to 2001. One suspects that this is, at least in part, and perhaps Darryl will remember the conversations more, the impetus to mission above everything else, and that may well reflect something in Paul's sort of setting against it, but also that the fact that covenant doesn't stand outside of time and effect. And I wonder how much, if you look at what Paul's talking, the early covenants and sort of 17th century, early 18th century covenants, how they dealt with the time when largely membership and attendance tended to be quite close. As you move on through the 18th and into the 19th century, you get members and perhaps 3, 4, 5 times as many hearers as you do members. And therefore it's much, how do you work a covenant out? And some would say you get similar problems with people who say, I come but don't want to be a member. Yeah. But I guess the other thing is equally that it's not unseen that covenant is being appealed to now quite strongly at a time of upheaval and conflicting views, as a way of pulling together different ideas behind a common concept. And I think it's that interesting, because reflecting again what's been said about it is God who calls us together. It is more about that we should be covenanting because we're part of the union together, and at least being listening and being nice to one another, rather than saying actually there's something deeper in what you're doing here, and actually to act in a way that lacks clarity or sympathy or fellowship is not simply because you're right and other people are wrong, but that somehow you're missing the point about God.
Thank you, Stephen. Ashley.
Just coming on the back of what Stephen was saying, you wrote a very good book on the struggle in the 90s. So for those who didn't see, that's Andy's book on the struggle in the 90s for, you could say, the soul of the denomination, and the struggle between mission and covenantal thinking as different streams. That's an aside. I wanted to make the point, I think we are focusing on the way that the covenant works out in the horizontal dimension. I think actually many Baptists have no problem with the way the covenant works out in the vertical dimension. I think most Baptists would see and would resonate with the idea that we are adopted into the family of God, that God adopts us, that there is so this idea of this covenant of grace, and this idea in which God adopts us and brings us into, but I think when it comes to the more horizontal, where Baptists struggle, or certainly where I think most Christians struggle, has this echo for me, sorry for those in the States and Australia, but has this echo for me of Margaret Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society. There is just there is the nation as a whole, and there is the individual. And then I think for many Baptists, there's God and the church as a whole, and there's the individual. And there's this level, these middle levels in between seem to have been lost altogether. That there is this sense of any locally gathered, or so we just have. So I think Baptists would see themselves as part of the church, and then part of the church they choose, but that's as an individual. But I think so they would feel themselves as belonging to, and I think this is partly where Nigel Wright goes with our Baptist evangelicals, the sense of we do want to belong to a bigger crowd, but it's a theologically defined crowd largely, and some of us of course push back against that and question whether we are evangelicals, but that's another matter. All my time in local church ministry, I was always struggling to get Baptists to think about being a gathered community, always struggling with the church to get them to see themselves as somehow called together by God into this local expression of the church. I would push it all the time, and it just never seemed to land.
But then I wonder whether actually some of this is replicated in other institutions that we wouldn't group under the title of covenant, but which do achieve some of these things. I mean, certainly in our church, people belong to life groups, right? They're rooted in a small group community, right? They're 6 to 12 people who they look out for one another in WhatsApp groups. They're encouraged to do mission projects together. I suppose these are all expressions of, to use Karen's insistence upon the prior calling of God amongst the people being the efficacious thing rather than the explicit enunciation of the words of the covenant promises as being the key moment. I wonder whether if people come together and they regularly meet together in a church, and then they regularly meet together with the people in a life group, and they're involved in serving their local communities in evangelism or in social outreach, aren't they just living out covenant already? They're just not using the language of covenant to describe it. I mean, on the second point, partly what you're describing about the generic evangelicalism is definitely true. I mean, I wrote a paper when I was, so this is now dating me, 2013, on ecumenical expressions that my ecumenical visiting as part of my education at Spurgeon's was, I went to Westminster Chapel, nominally a Congregationalist church, and an Anglican church down the road for 2 separate visits. And my conclusion was, if you closed your eyes when you were in any of the buildings, in my church, their church, or either of their churches, you wouldn't have known which church you were in. Right, the worship, the liturgy was functionally the same. The style of sermon giving was functionally the same. It's just the breakdown of denominationalism that partly accounts, I think, for the lack of a Baptist distinctiveness. Right, I mean, I think my church now has got, well, I describe them charitably, lapsed Catholics, lapsed Methodists, lapsed Anglicans, and a few Baptists, all of whom associate with us, a fair few Pentecostals. They seem to find it, they can just move between the denominations without there being any cause for concern or noticeable difference for them. And I'm not sure I think that's a problem.
Well, I just want to push back very slightly on your comment about life groups and things, and are these covenantal? And I guess my problem with them is that they're self-selecting, a lot of these groups. And so I'm asking myself, if we are gathered, if we are called into, if we use that language of gathered and called into, then we don't just pick the people we feel most at home with or who are most like me to be in these groups with. You know, so what happens to those who are marginalized? What happens to those who are not like us? If you push a covenantal, if you think through the covenantal idea that Paul, I think, wants to get us to think through, we end up in groups of people who are not like us because we're called together. And that underlies, well, I have a feeling that in these groups that the way they self-select is that people fit very comfortably together. They have similar life experiences, perhaps similar some similar sort of ideas about faith and stuff, and they're comfortable and easy. And I'm just pushing that. I'm not saying that's
no.
fair,
I think that's interesting,
but it's how it feels.
I think that's interesting. Although I suppose if I want to be provocative, I would say that kind of self-selecting thing is intrinsic in a believer's church model, right? That whatever we believe theologically about the eternal and divine call of God, which draws us into the body of Christ, if you're in a Baptist church or a free church model, you attend the church that you choose to attend, and you're baptized into that church. It's not one that anybody else has selected for you, right? And so to some extent, that idea of voluntarism is just intrinsic to what we believe about the fact that one has to choose to be a disciple of Christ. Now, you can, as a church leader, you can do things to mitigate against that. So we try and consciously mix up our life groups in terms of age, nationality, that type of thing, and strongly suggest to people that they go to one place or another, so to keep the groups mixed. But I would love to hear the alternative, right? You'd have to have a Baptist church where people didn't choose to go there, where it was chosen for them. But then there is a name for that type of church, and it's Roman Catholicism, right?
Well, I would argue I'm in a Baptist church partly because I didn't choose to go there, but because I'm a Baptist and I moved and I found the Baptist church that was nearest to me. But, you know, I accept that I'm possibly exceptional in that sense.
This might reflect
draw a line that other people
so it seems to me is we quite, we're liking 1, eternal covenant. Yeah, we're happy with that. We like 4, the idea of, hey, let's covenant with some friends in a church. What Paul wants to do is put 2, I think, in the mix, but with his shaping around participation. So I think Phil used the language of I can't remember what it was, something transaction, but Paul wants to talk about participating in God, and that's the mix. It's not that actually the reason I ended up in a Baptist church was not because I chose it. It was because that was how God gathered me into. It just so happened it was that one, into that place. And that, whenever you become a Christian, you don't become a Christian by yourself. You're gathered into a community. And
you're not still in that community, are you, Andy? Right? I mean, if you were to move near me, and even if you wanted to say, I definitely want a Baptist church, within 5 miles there are 4 Baptist churches, right? None of which were the community I was saved in. That's my point, right? Is at some point I'm going to be selecting between these churches. I'm not wanting to make a bigger theological point on it. I'm just saying that there is inevitably an element of choice in that.
I don't think anyone was trying to take choice away, like in the rest of the conversation.
I'm not arguing for choice as a virtue, by the way. I'm not arguing for it as a virtue. I'm just saying I think it's inevitable that there will be an element of choosing people going to the place that they feel most comfortable being in.
Well, I think that, so for the sake of I just think that, again, anyways, I think that to not flatten this into a dichotomy or an either or, which is, I think, one of the things that Andy was trying to get to, if Paul's working with covenant on 4 levels and we're not working with 4 levels, I think we may be missing part of the complexity of his thought praxis here, so that it is gathering and also I feel led, and then there's spiritual discernment, in all of these things. And I think that, I also kind of want to stick up for the congregants who may have been formed to think they're expected to be consumers in all of our churches. And so if they feel conditioned to do that, part of the struggle in the congregation and in coming together in covenant and realizing we've been drawn here is, how are we remade by doing these things together among ourselves and in our world? And so that, I think, we may not have time to get through the discipline part the chapter, like that's actually language I'm really not comfortable with, because it's really not the language I use all the time, but I do use language like formation and discipleship and worship and like walking together and watched care and some of the stuff that we talked about in the McClendon reading group with ethics and watched care. And so that also, I just want to dump all of that into the pot as well, because like some of it is going to feel like a choice. There is a level of society where we are both choosing and also acting in responsibility to one another. And we also have these things called passions and desires and likes and dislikes and differences. And like, so the depth of human existence can also be expressed in society and covenant. And like, I just think that what Paul is doing and doing the depth of the Trinity in those first three, at least, maybe he can't quite get to it in number 4, but it might, maybe it's, you know, I mean, like in the rest of the book. So anyway, that's.
Yeah. And I think this is partly it. It's, you can't, Mark, I'll let you come in and have the last word before we finish. And Darryl, if we're quick, is you can't just have a covenant Sunday and say, right, I've done covenant, everyone's got covenant. This is an ongoing, week in, week out, educating, forming, shaping a group of people to say, actually, you're not here just because you chose to be here, but God called you here. And God didn't just call you here as an individual, but he called you here as a fellowship. It's for me, and that's the thing, it has to have a whole set of an ongoing shaping and talking in that way. And I wonder if we reduce covenant to, oh, we did a covenant Sunday once a year, which is what the Methodists do. The Methodists have their kind of covenant service once a year. I think the Baptist idea is much richer in that way. I'm going to bring in Mark, then Darryl, and then we're going to kind of bring it to a close this evening, because we're going to come back and talk about covenant a lot more if you keep coming to this group, because Paul does.
I was just two long things. One is that I think the Baptist conception is richer, and also alongside it also poorer than the Methodist view. It depends, because I don't think we can expunge that sort of commercialism, you know, the commercial view, and just say that's not Baptist. I think that little section of in this chapter with the kind of pedigree from, you know, from Smith forward shows that, you know, that is Baptist as well. And that's part of the conversation to have, is does our actual practice of covenanting sometimes actually reduce, and has it reduced our faith to a version of commercialism? And if it's not to be that, you know, I really like the notion of, I think we've talked about this before in other times, of characteristic damage of practices from Lauren Winner, who is our characteristic damage of the practice of covenanting, that which actually evacuates God at times and leads to a kind of consumerism. On top of that, I think just what, as Laura was saying, the practices of covenanting that might be a participation in God, not just how did I come to be in this church, but what does it mean to be walking together? What are the practices of walking together that could be termed a participation in God, could be seen to be, or even, you know, God forbid, watching over one another, that could still be a participation in God. One of the things I was really intrigued by Ryan Andrew Newson's talk about friendship. And I don't think he uses particularly covenantal language, but there you might find a schooling in covenantal practice that developed friendship in faith that is actually missionally useful, rather than becoming a dichotomy between mission and covenant, that you're schooled in friendship and you're able to become friends with people who are different from you, and actually recognize God in people who maybe don't even recognize God in themselves at times. So I think there is a rich sort of mission potential, but it's kind of getting down to covenant as a practice that can be seen as a participation in God.
Thanks, Mark. Darryl.
Thanks, Andy. I just wanted to, I guess, observe that the focus of our conversation with respect to conditional unconditional dynamics, I think, has, I guess, tended to follow fairly familiar and remain within fairly familiar boundaries, in that it's tended to be largely around divine action, divine agency, and the local congregation. And I just make the observation that Paul's work, of course, pushes us, not only in the chapter here, but also in what he was doing within the life of the Union, pushes or was challenging us, calling us to consider these themes in terms of our associational life together, but also ecumenically. And I know, Mark, you popped that ecumenical question in at the first set of questions. And it seems to me that we're not well versed or well equipped in having those discussions in the context of covenant. And it might be that might be partially, as it were, a bit of a window, an insight into why Paul's work, we've struggled to really take hold of it in the way he might have hoped us to do so, and why some of those reports still languish on shelves or in archives in the Angus, because we didn't know what to do with them. And I hope as we work through Paul's book and pick up later chapters around ecumenism, we're able to revisit those themes and to see those through the lens of covenant, because I still think those are as yet untapped and largely unexplored.
Thank you, Daryl. So in many ways, we will continue this conversation. So if you had more to say, we're coming next time, if you're able to gather with us, we're looking at chapter 4, where Paul does his ecclesiology, which, yes, you guess it, you'll find covenant participation, body language running through it. And so we'll come back and we'll address these things, perhaps from a different angle, a different perspective. But thank you for joining us this evening and for your contributions. We will be back, whatever it is, the third Sunday evening, Monday morning in April, looking at chapter 4. We're missing out 3. We're going to bring chapter 3 right in at the end of our time. So chapter 4 next, but there'll be emails about that. Okay.